Is this working? It is. Hello, I'm Stewart. Thanks so much for coming to this session. Before I introduce Owen and Clive, I just want to say that next week, 2 weeks' time, we were supposed to have Margaret Hodge, who unfortunately can't come now. So Margaret's going to come next term, along with other speakers like Lisa Nandy and a few others. So hope you can come to those as well. This week, we're delighted to have Clive Lewis, MP, and Owen Jones, two leading lights of the left, two people who in an hour and a half can sort out every problem that anyone in this room wants to invent. Clive, we're really grateful for you sparing the time. Owen as well, thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks.
Cheers, Stuart. That's fine. Yes, we can do this. Well, thank you, Stuart. That's very kind of you. Thank you for inviting both of us. We're going to solve all the problems of the left, the existential crisis, in an hour and a half. A very easy brief. I hope that's okay with you, Clive.
Happy days.
It's been such an uneventful year. There's so little to talk about, honestly. 6 weeks left, so anything could happen. So, let's kick off. Now, Clive.
Owen.
The 1930s was a turbulent decade, to say the least. After the Great Depression, you saw the rise of far-right movements which overwhelmed European democracy. Now, in the aftermath of the financial crash, we've seen the rise of right-wing populism. We've just seen, of course, the election of Donald Trump. We've seen the aftermath of Brexit and how it's been framed. Enemies of the people, as judges wanting to scrutinise the process have been called. We've seen in France the National Front, the era of Vichy fascism leading in the opinion polls. In places like Hungary and Poland, right-wing populist authoritarian governments now rule. Across Scandinavia and elsewhere, the far right are on the march. Is this, do you think, a rerun of the 1930s? Is that a danger?
What's the bad news?
Yes. We will cheer people up by the end of this, but realism.
I don't think we can say exactly that the 1930s are being relived. I don't think history exactly repeats itself.
But it rhymes.
It often rhymes, yes. I would say that we are at a crossroads. I think if you read, which you obviously do, read the media, read what's happening at the moment, there is a sense that we are facing a kind of existential crisis or situation on the left in Western liberal democracies. So in that sense, I can see the parallels, but there are differences from the 1930s. And I would say that some of them are, we still have the leftovers, what's left of the welfare state in this country and across much of Europe. And I think that does make a difference in the sense that many of the kind of the abject poverty that was around in the 1930s, the abject hopelessness, isn't exactly the same as it was. But the other issue as well as I think is technology and the potential for technology. And I think this is in many ways democratizing and changing the political situation in ways which no one ever really thought of or ever really realized. And it's very different. So it's not exactly the same as the 1930s, but I do agree with you that when you look at Trump, when you look at Le Pen and you look at the rise of the right, you look at what they're talking about, you look at the insecurity that many people are facing, you do begin to see parallels. But I think it's too early to say that it's going to be a rerun of the 1930s. But I think you'd also be very stupid and very unwise to take anything for granted and not be prepared. And obviously the reason that so many people on the left and across politics generally in this country and beyond are questioning where politics are going is because there is a fear that we're heading into a dark chapter. It might not be exactly the same as the 1930s, but it could still be dark. Yeah, so I don't think it is the 1930s, but I think there are similarities.
Now, obviously, we're talking about the future of the left, but we do need to understand and appreciate what we're up against. Donald Trump, now, when he launched his presidential campaign last year, he was a joke. People just laughing almost about it. I don't think many people are laughing quite so hard anymore. Why do you think, what's your analysis of why Donald Trump became the most powerful individual on earth?
I think there are lots of reasons. I don't think it's just simply about the Rust Belt. I don't think it's just simply about people being angry. I think you also have to look at the candidate themselves. I think you probably would have struggled to find a worse candidate in an election that was framed by the establishment versus radical change. I think Hillary Clinton on paper is an excellent candidate. Apart from the fact that she is a woman, she's well connected, intelligent, lots of experience, but there's also all the things that go against her. Connections to Wall Street, her email server, the whole dynastic component, and I think that was a part of it. I also think people underestimate Trump's ability to communicate. He communicates in a very strange way, but if you've watched his hand gestures and how he talks, I found myself personally quite mesmerized by how he speaks, his syntax. It's odd, but actually, in a way, it kind of cuts through, and it obviously cuts through to vast swathes of people in America and beyond. So I think if you're gonna look at why he was successful, there's a multitude of reasons. One of them, though, I think, and I'm quite clear about this, is that he is playing on an economic system which, for the last 35 or 40 years, we often call it neoliberalism, and it's a word that we're not allowed to say these days because it's a bit of a cliche. But actually, it's an economic system which has driven far too many people onto the margins, insecurity in their lives, and consequently, with the right cheerleaders, with the right political and economic situation, he's been able to capitalize on that and portray himself as a champion of change against the establishment. And yet we're already seeing the very people he's surrounding himself with are the very scions of that establishment, the very people who in many ways have led America down that path. So I think you've got to look for the last 30 or 40 years in many ways for some of the reasons why he's there, and also the candidate that the Democrats put up. I think she played a big part in that. I was a Bernie supporter. I thought Bernie was a fantastic candidate. Unfortunately, Bernie failed to connect with African Americans, one of the key reasons for his failure. I hope he has another crack. There is Elizabeth Warren as well. There are other people out there. But ultimately, she was the wrong candidate at the wrong time.
Now, Brexit is the most seismic political event, arguably, since 1945 in this country. To what extent would you link what's happened in the United States, that result, to what's happened here?
Well, there's three things that people are linking: Trump, Brexit, and Corbyn. And obviously, Corbyn isn't like Trump. He's very different. I can vouch for that. He's very different. But I think what Corbyn was a precursor. I think the alarm bells of some people should have been ringing. I remember when Jeremy came out of his talk on his economic policies, the first time round the leadership election. And it was just after Tony Blair had said, start thinking with your heads, not your hearts. And, he was quite, heart transplant. It was quite tough, quite hard.
He basically was Corbyn's PR manager.
Oh, well, it looks like it, because I remember that was the turning point in the Corbyn campaign, because, Jeremy Corbyn obviously had, 10, 20 people at this press conference. I think there was tumbleweed blowing through it because most of them were at the Tony Blair press conference. And so they've all rushed over to Jeremy Corbyn's conference, and he's come out with a piece of paper expecting, I think, someone from Heart FM to be there. And he's come out, and the world's media are outside, and he's taken, and I actually think he gave a very dignified response. But the point is, I remember seeing an interview after with someone from the BBC. It was a BBC correspondent, and Jeremy was talking to him, and as he was talking, he said, so Jeremy Corbyn, you don't actually think you can win, do you? Like that. And I remember he actually laughed as he asked Jeremy that, and Jeremy said, I'm going to put forward a campaign on the issues, on the policies, not the personalities, and so on. And I think what we've seen time after time is the very people who've told us that, when we've gone on as Labour politicians for the last 6 years, that, what are you going to do about bringing the debt down? How are you going to tackle austerity? What cuts are you going to make? There's no way out of this. You've got to make some hard decisions. How are you going to do it? The very people, the very establishment, if you want, who have told us this is how politics works, this is how it is, have called it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think on Jeremy Corbyn, you can begin to see, you saw the seeds of people who desperately wanted something to change. Something was wrong, something wasn't working. And these weren't all kind of liberal, metropolitan elitists that were kind of voting Jeremy Corbyn. He's won a wide swathe of people to his cause. But I think what you can see is that people had a hunger for something different. They understood something wasn't working, and they wanted to see a real change. And I think when you see it with Jeremy Corbyn, you can then see with Brexit, some people obviously have begun to understand, Nigel Farage and others, that there was a message which was beginning to resonate with people, that things aren't working, that you don't get listened to, that democracy isn't working, that the economy isn't working for you. Their solutions were completely wrong.
Take back
and the
control.
take back control. But this was fantastic framing, and it cut through, and it wasn't racist. Taking back control isn't racist. It's about sovereignty. So I think in many ways they tapped in and they played in to those fears, to those that people's angst for change, about being forgotten, and they won. And I think the same thing with Donald Trump in many ways is part of the reason why he won. So I think there are similarities between all three situations. I don't know what will happen in France next year with Marine Le Pen. I don't know what will happen in Germany. But I do understand, and I think, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's quite clear that the way politics has been done the last 30 or 40 years isn't working. It's not working for a large number of people, or at least they perceive it's not working for them. And they're looking at their pocket, they're looking at their debt when they come out of university, they're looking at their job prospects, they're looking at the fact that there's a good chance that they'll never own their own home, a good chance that they'll never be able to afford to live in a safe social housing home, affordable home. So I think as you begin to go through, you begin to work out that we have an economic system which isn't working for people, and clearly now people are looking for difference. Now, I think what our job is on the left, and we're talking about the future of the left, is to offer radical, credible solutions to the economic situation that we find ourselves in. The right are doing that, and bizarrely, it's the Conservatives who are trying to paint themselves as anti-establishment and paint the left as the establishment. Now, I actually think if we didn't have Jeremy Corbyn and the new management of the Labour Party, and people can talk about how far we are in the polls and Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, the reality is if we had Yvette Cooper, I'm afraid to say, or if we had Liz Kendall or Andy Burnham for that extent, I kind of feel they were too closely associated with all that has gone on, and I think they would have fallen into that bracket far too easily. The thing with Jeremy, the thing where the Labour Party is now, we have actually got a fighting chance of saying, hey, we're under new management. We were, for the last 40 years, we've been telling people that this economic system was going to end up like this. And they were right. The left has been consistently right on calling out the economy and calling out the effects of austerity, and calling out the effects of untrammeled globalization, which doesn't help people, which leaves people insecure, calling out what would happen, and we're now there. So I kind of think they need a little bit of a break, actually. They won't get it, but I think they deserve it.
We'll come on to that. Now, the left and Brexit. Now, I'm going to just come on to immigration. I know it's difficult to disentangle immigration from Brexit, but when I talk about Labour's electoral coalition, because if you look at Labour voters, there was one chunk, a minority, but a substantial minority, who voted to leave the European Union, often in northern industrial or ex-industrial heartlands. But then you get what you could call despondent Remainers. These are people who think Brexit is a hellish nightmare. They hate it. And 44% of existing Labour voters, they want a second referendum. Now, that's not politically tenable, because if you rerun Brexit, the referendum on first past the post, Leave would win 425 seats, because Remain piled their votes up in big urban centres like London, Manchester, Birmingham, and so on. But in terms of how is Labour supposed to straddle that, and I would put it to you, do you think it's not failing to do that at the moment? When John McDonnell yesterday says those who oppose activating Article 50 are allies of the corporate elites. Lots of people who think activating Article 50 might be a necessary evil, but they will find that very, very insulting. And they will possibly think, we do have elsewhere to go, we'll just vote Green or Lib Dem in that case. So do you think Labour's failing at the moment to get a clear position on Brexit that brings that coalition together?
I think it's very difficult because we're a broad party, and there are some people in the party who want a second referendum. There are some people who don't want to trigger Article 50, and there are those who want to trigger Article 50 and get on with it. I think my interpretation of what John McDonnell says, and I didn't see his comment, but my interpretation of that is that what he's saying is that if you if you back or vote a second referendum, if you look to stop the triggering of Article 50, you're playing into the hands of the right and those corporate interests, rather than kind of saying that you are, scions or neoliberalism. I think what he was saying is you're playing into the hands. That's my interpretation of it. And I think there's an element of truth to that. I think, look, I fought in the Remain campaign. I did a lot of work with Another Europe.
We shared many a platform.
We shared many a platform, and I did stuff with the Labour Party as well. I kind of had an issue with Europe. I thought it was a kind of a neoliberal entity, and kind of in many ways, played its part in where we were, although we were at the kind of cutting edge of that neoliberal exercise. But I thought ultimately you have to be in it to win it. And so I was part of the Another Europe campaign, that we wanted to be part of the broad swathe of the left within Europe, campaigning for a different kind of social Europe. But we lost. And I had to speak to my CLP the other day, and there were some really angry people because they were saying, what are you going to do on Article 50? We hope you're going to vote against triggering Article 50. And I said, well, why would you say that? Because you're our MP, you're our Labour MP, and Norwich voted by about 62% for Remain. So you have a duty to Norwich South. And I said, I understand that, but I also have a duty to the country. And I'm not going to vote Article 50 just because that's the three-whip line that we might have. I'm doing it because you're playing into the hands of the authoritarian right. We lost the vote. And you can squirm about how unfair it was, about they lied about the NHS, they lied on the facts and the figures, about the fact that you can go on and on about how unfair it was, about there wasn't a minimum threshold for turnout, about 16 and 17-year-olds weren't able to vote. But ultimately we took part in that referendum, and we fought in that referendum, and we legitimised that referendum by being a part of it. If we'd said, hey, we're not taking part in this is flawed, then we'd have an argument to be able to stand against it. But we took part in it, and we lost. We lost. And so now we're in the position where, yes, it's only indicative. Parliament could overturn it. It's only an indicative. There's nothing in law which means that we have to enact Article 50. But if we do that, the message that we send out to all those people who, for a variety of reasons, who wanted to take back control, some about immigration, but for a variety of reasons, the message we send to them is, democracy is great when we get our way, but when you have your say, we're not interested. And Nigel Farage, as we've already seen, and the right, the authoritarian right of this country, will play on that. So I think what I had to say to my CLP is, I was a little bit of a wind-up merchant, but I said to him, say the words, we're leaving Europe. Get used to it. Say it, because it's happening. And where the fight is now, it's on the relationship we have with Europe. That's where the fight is. That's what it looks like. And that's where we can hold the government to account. That's where we will draw the line and have our fight with them. Not on triggering Article 50, because the reality is we're now leaving the European Union. The only argument is, what would our relationship look like? I don't think there's any other position. I don't think you can make your fight.
So what will it look like? Let's just, very succinctly, let's do it if we can sell this on the doorstep. What would Labour, if Jeremy Corbyn, if you were all in government now, what would the strategy be? What would you be negotiating?
So I think it would be a bespoke agreement. So I don't think we're going to look at the Norwegian or the Swiss model. And I think it would be access to the single market for goods and services in sectors that needed it. It might be all sectors. It might be the whole economy. It might just be certain sectors which really needed it. And we could go through that on a sector-by-sector basis. There's a report being done by government looking at the implications of Brexit sector by sector. So I think the first thing and the priority for a Labour Party in those negotiations would be on maintaining the best access to the single market. And the other part of that is we do still need, there is a skills gap in this country. That's a whole other conversation about how skills and training in this country have fallen so woefully behind. But companies in this country still need access, in particular to skilled labour from across Europe. And we have to ensure that. Now, I understand the quid pro quo, the issue we have is that there are many people who feel the issue of immigration, freedom of movement, is a problem. Now, I think on the left, we have to kind of take a pretty pragmatic approach. First of all, you can't ignore what some people feel. All of those 17 million people didn't vote on the issue of immigration. A number did, but not all of them. But you still have to take into account how people feel about immigration. And I'm not just saying platitudes and there, I hear what you're saying, but you have to take it into account. And you have to understand why people feel like they do. To my mind, what I do know is that if we go down the path of putting up barriers to immigration, putting arbitrary numbers on the number of people that can come from Europe, we probably won't get the deal we want in terms of the single market. And on top of that, we'll also probably send our economy into a nosedive, into a recession. And the very people who most need the economy to be working, the very people who have the least capacity to be able to survive a downturn, a recession, with the least skills, least training, are the people most likely to be hurt by that. The people most likely then, I think, in such an economic recession, be more susceptible to looking to demagogues and demagoguery for their solutions. So I think my personal solution on the issue of immigration from Europe is, well, there are two things. First of all, I agree with those people who say we should wait until after 2017. Now, I might not get that, and we're not in the driving seat, the government is, but I think we should wait until after 2017 to see how those elections go. Because I think where Europe is at the moment on this issue, there's a potential that after 2017, there could be a sea change on the issue of freedom of movement, which may mean that we can get a better deal on that issue, which is more in tune with the new order in Europe after 2017, the new political mood. That's the first thing. But secondly, I personally think any British company that wants to bring people into this country from abroad, I think those people personally should be in trade unions. And I think the issue, what that does, it gets to the issue. Now that's not going to necessarily put an arbitrary figure on how many people can come in. I think it will reduce the number of people coming in. But what it does, it gets to the very root cause of why people feel so insecure. Now, people say to me, well, there's no evidence that immigration undercuts. There's no evidence. But the reality is, if you increase the supply of labour, then supply and demand, it's just basic economics. They've got more people, then the supply, that's going to suppress wages. That's going to have an effect in this country. So I think what you have to do, and I think you have to get to the root cause of why people feel insecure, and it's about insecurity at work, insecurity in their place in the world, insecurity in their communities, low pay, poverty, lack of any kind of opportunity in their lives, or a fear for their children having a lesser standard of living than they do. So I think unless you get to the root cause of that, why that's happening, you're going to fail. So,
I mean, that issue, immigration, because it's probably, of all issues, causing the biggest schism on the traditional European left in terms of the crisis of European social democracy. And here, like other countries, you often get people who live in big cities, particularly younger and university-educated people, who are generally quite well disposed towards immigration, don't like anything that sounds like anti-immigration sentiment. They're part of Labour's coalition, they've increased in number. Then you've got small towns, often older working-class people in small towns, who really don't want immigration at all. They regard it as the root cause of their economic, social, and often cultural insecurity. So while I grew up in Stockport narrowly voted to remain, but not the part of Stockport I grew up in, very few immigrants, but lots of anti-immigration sentiment. Do you think there's a danger? Because if I was going to be unkind about the last Labour leadership, I'd say they came up with this kind of mush on immigration which didn't really satisfy anybody. Is there the danger, that's a kind of Stewart Wood there grimacing at me, but is there a danger you're going to fall into that trap? Because there are two parts of that coalition, it's very difficult to keep them together.
It's possible. I know that the Labour Party cannot compete with UKIP or the Tories in how low they'll sink on the issue of immigration. We can't. No. We never can, and if we did, we wouldn't be the Labour Party. Which means that if you go down the path, if you begin to throw, okay, let's say we'll stop, we'll allow 100,000 people from Europe in, 200,000. As soon as you begin to put arbitrary figures on the number of people that can come into this country, we've seen that arbitrary caps don't work. The Tories' immigration model for the rest of the world outside of Europe constantly failed. They constantly went over. They couldn't control it. Maybe they can control it from Europe, I don't know. But what I do know, if you go down that path, it will never be enough. There'll always be more. And it basically legitimizes those who say that immigration is the cause of all these problems. The issue is, for me, that immigration has been a net contributor. It's been a net benefit to our economy. The problem is, who's benefited from immigration? Who's benefited from that extra wealth that it's created and generated? It hasn't been, by and large, the vast majority of working people in this country. That's why we're one of the most unequal societies in the world. So I understand what you're saying about the fudge, but I'm afraid to say, if we're going to find a solution, it has to be a solution rooted not just in our values, but it has to be a solution rooted in the actual economic cause of people's perception that immigration is damaging their community, damaging their way of living. But I think there's another side of it as well, which we don't often talk about, which is, I think, many communities, many people, increasingly in England, and it depends on what part of England you're in, are feeling increasingly bereft of any kind of cultural identity, or cultural identity has been torn up. I think, after the Second World War, there was a British cultural identity developed. It was based on the welfare state. It was based on the NHS, on public ownership. And I think people felt that they were part of something. And obviously, after the last 35, 40 years, that's had its heart ripped out. The NHS is on its knees. It's a third of it has been privatised. Public services, in bits. 2012, the Olympic Games. The NHS was what our national identity was. And now I think increasingly people are seeing the Scots go off. They've got Scottish nationalism, civic nationalism, as some people call it. But the Scots seem to be kind of happy in their shell.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because the left often, in England in particular, has quite an uncomfortable relationship with patriotism. People often on the left, particularly in big urban cities, will think it's a byword for chauvinism or racism or imperialism. But for millions of people, particularly, lots of natural Labour supporters, patriotism is very important indeed, and they often think the left's contemptuous of it. So what is a left patriotism? What does it look like?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn had a stab at it when he said, patriotism is paying your taxes. And I think it's a very, very small start at the conversation, but it's a start, and I think it fits into a framework and a narrative that I understand and can get. I think ultimately, what we on the left have to do. And there are some people who think we shouldn't even have this conversation. I was having a conversation with someone on the train. So we shouldn't be having this conversation. We're pandering. I don't need to feel the need for nationalism. I don't need to feel the need for patriotism. I'm a citizen of the world. Well, that's fine. And often the people who voted Remain, many of those will feel that. But there are lots of people, 17 million of them at least potentially, that don't feel that way. And I'm someone who grew up. My dad's from Grenada. My mum's English, working class. My dad came from Grenada, and I grew up in a household where when I became kind of 13, 14, I began to understand. I had a very English upbringing. My dad, kind of stepped back. I had my black identity to an extent, but I didn't know that much about it. I was far more, as my dad called me, an Englishman. And when I got to about 13, 14, 15, I started to do GCSE history, and I started reading about the slave trade and about empire and about colonialism. And I became really, really angry. And I actually began to think I actually don't like my English side. I'm ashamed of it. Why did they do this? Why did they, my name, Lewis, it's a slave name. It was given to me by a slave owner for my ancestors 400 years ago. And it made me angry. But what it did, as I went through that journey, I began to realise, actually, no, I'm actually really proud of what I am, but where I am now. And, it's also the country that gave me an education, that gave my dad a job, that gave, me a schooling, that gave us a house, that had the Race Relations Act, that protected my family. I got to go to university. So I saw it in its entirety. So I think, for me, patriotism, I've kind of been through a journey. My identity, English identity, I'm happy with that, being on the left, but also acknowledging that it can be a positive force. We've all seen athletes, parading with the flag, proud that they've won for their country. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's great. I think that they're proud of what they are and who they are and what they've won and the community they represent. So I think there are lots of positive values about English nationalism that we can talk about and we can explain and we can push. I think it's right that the left does that, because if we don't, the vacuum's filled by the old historical English nationalism, which historically has been, I think, a negative and violent force. You only have to ask the Irish, the Welsh and the Scottish, or a big part of the former, the Commonwealth, about that. So English nationalism can have a very dark side to it, but I think it's incumbent upon the left not to allow that vacuum to happen. And I think we can actually have a kind of a Scottish equivalent of English nationalism, of English cultural identity. And I think that's the other side of the coin when we talk about the issue of immigration and the economic impact of it and its cause on those tensions in immigration. I think there's a cultural and a nationalist side, and I think it's really important. So basically what I'm saying is, someone who's been on the journey myself and understands the dark side of English nationalism as well as the positives, I think you can make the argument for a positive English patriotic nationalism which is inclusive, which is civic, which is positive, which is outward facing. I think you can do that. I think it's possible. I think we have to do it.
In terms of the left intellectually, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, you know, the new right policies, that didn't come out of nowhere. It was decades of preparation. I mean, after World War II, they met in Montpellier in Switzerland. I've given you the wrong water, haven't I? And they, you know, Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, they set up, you know, they didn't mourn, they organised, they set up think tanks, and they spent decades laying the intellectual foundations. Do you think probably we just haven't done that? Often the left just goes, let's just be nostalgic about 1945 and somehow one day replicate that. And, you know, because we got you know, so-and-so kicked out of us in the 80s. We had the rise of the new right, the unions, our traditional backbone, were devastated. We had this form of globalisation that reduced the power of the state. We had the end of the Cold War that was presented as the end of history. You know, no alternative to free market capitalism. I mean, do you think there just isn't those foundations now? So when someone like Jeremy Corbyn becomes a leader, it's kind of you're kind of having to make it up as you go along a bit.
Yeah, there is an element of that. I think there are definitely the Montpellier set, the whole way that, you know, most people in this room could probably articulate the Conservative frames for the last election. You know, Labour didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. You maxed out on the credit card. Now we're the only ones that can, you know, sort the economy out. So blah blah blah. You couldn't tell Labour's one. And so much of what they did and the frames and the narrative that they used and they exploited have been built up over a long number of years. Mm-hmm. I get that completely. I think the difference now is the Tory party hasn't always been ideological. I don't think it has. I think Thatcher and Sir Keith Joseph and those who came from the kind of Montpellier set, the neoliberal kind of background, I think that was very different for the Conservatives. They became ideological after Thatcher. I think before, post 45, 79, I think the Conservative Party was very unideological. It basically did what it needed to win. That's my understanding. People may say, you know, I have a different take on that, but I don't think the Conservative Party was as ideological in that period. They
defended the Attlee consensus.
You know, that was the reality. That was the consensus, the kind of post-45 consensus, and they embraced the NHS. They embraced state socialism and state control, and they ran with it in their own way. But they did. But the problem the Conservatives have got now is that they're looking to shift. I mean, if you listen to Conservatives now, like I talk to in the House of Commons, I mean, they're talking about capital controls, some of them. I mean, capital control. I mean, if you said that in the PLP a year ago, you'd have come out with there'd have been eggs and bricks thrown at you. You know, so this is Tories talking
the PLP's very harmonious, Clive.
I know, that's not quite fair, not bricks. So, I think my point here is they are moving away from their ideological base. We were in a debate on workers' rights the other week, and one of their MPs stood up and went, would the Secretary of State agree that the best way to secure prosperity for all is laissez-faire, free markets, and deregulation? And he was laughed at, you know, across the House. You know, I found that really interesting because clearly, look, there are people like Liam Fox and others who genuinely believe that, you know, see Brexit as an opportunity for a deregulatory bonfire and so on. But ultimately, I think they're now moving into territory. They understand that their economic system that they championed for the last 35, 40 years is falling apart. You know, 2008 was the economic consequences of neoliberalism, if you like, and 2016 the political. And they are now quickly, hastily trying to make a land grab for, I think, social democratic values, for social democratic issues, things which I think is our turf. They're talking about industrial strategy. They're talking about workers on boards, on employment boards and so on. I kind of think to myself, that's our territory. Hold on a second, that's our territory. And we've been talking about this for the past 40 years. So if they're coming onto our territory now, then it should be easier for us to be able to communicate these ideas and issues out to the public. And I actually think there's an opportunity for us here because, you know, my opposite is Greg Clark. I know he's got a fight on his hands. He would love to be far more radical, to kind of leave the ideological baggage of the last 40 years that Liam Fox and others champions and be able to come onto our territory. And I think Theresa May would as well. But she's got Peter Bone. She's got people in her party who would blow their top if they genuinely thought that she meant this. So I think there's an opportunity for the left to be able to now, if the Tories are coming on, this is our territory, this is our ground. And I think they're trying to basically jettison neoliberalism and again become a party that isn't attached to ideology, a party that's attached to winning, because that's what the Tories did throughout the 20th century, and that's what they want to do in the 21st. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to capitalise on that.
So, I mean, because they rage a lot of Ed Miliband's ideas, haven't they? And people say he's the most successful think tank in Britain. With the point about communication, that's a really important point, because, as you say, the Tories have very clear, and this is what the right do very well compared to the left, they have very clear messages they repeat over and over again. We're clearing up Labour's mess, we're balancing the nation's books, the deficit is like a household budget, long-term economic plan, everyone knows these off by heart, you know, and we're reforming welfare with some dog whistle about scroungers. But under, and again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be just in terms of critical of the last Labour leadership, because they often they had a vision which was very abstract, and they jumped from one to the other. Squeezed middle, remember that one? Promise of Britain, One Nation Britain,
Doing really well.
Pre-distribution, very catchy, and cost of living crisis. And they were all analyses of a problem, whilst the Tories, they stuck to the same messages over and over again, and they were based on solutions. Do you think, have we learned from that yet?
So I think one of the, I think when we talk, when people, on my election night, I said, I got famously quoted, I was tired, I hadn't slept for like 2 days. I was tired and emotional, as George Moody once said. I genuinely was, and I said, New Labour is dead. In one of my, it's a throwaway comment, and it ended up everywhere. And I think what I will say is, what it is important to do is, whilst there may have been some things that Labour got wrong in the 13 years of government and in the run-up to that, I think it's also important to understand there's a lot of things they got right. And just because it has New Labour attached to it doesn't mean it's wrong. And I think there is a tendency for some on the left to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And two of the things that I think New Labour got right was mantras and repeating them over and over, lines, and rebuttal. I think those are two things which we still haven't ever got back up to speed on as a party, and we have to. But in terms of what Ed Miliband and the Labour Party did between 2010 and 2015, I agree with you, because every time I turned the TV on, almost, it felt there was a new policy announcement, a new speech about where we're going, a new catchphrase, and it did feel disjointed. And I think one of the things I kind of brought to my brief in Biz is that we're taking a kind of mission-orientated approach to industrial strategy. And the way that we're going to, rather than endless policy announcements about, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be spending money on that, we're going to put our policy announcements within a framework. So what we do, we identify one of the key challenges to our society, maybe climate change was the one we announced today, and we work out a mission statement that is you can measure it yourself against and is verifiable. And from that, you then have a narrative, overarching narrative, which policy slots into. So rather than endless piece of policy, every time you say it, you can say, this is our mission, this is the problem, this is our mission, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we're going to achieve it. And I actually think that one of the key issues that we need to do as a party is to basically learn how to tell a story. We're not very good at telling stories. You need to find a narrative, a framework, and keep telling it. And there is a story out there to be told. We've just got to basically agree on it, the left agreeing on a story. That's half the problem. But we've got to agree on it and smash it, basically. And that's an oversimplification, clearly. But I think it's in terms of communication, I think it's a start.
Quickly on New Labour. I mean, in China, the official position is Chairman Mao was 60% good, 40% bad. What's your view on New Labour? You don't have to give percentages, but what's your overall view, just very kind of concisely, I want to bring in questions soon, but what were the main successes and what were the main failures of New Labour? What should the left's attitude be towards that period?
The successes of New Labour, it won. It won elections. That was its success. And if you think about it, in those 13 years, it did a lot of good. And I don't think you can take, and we've been talking about the messaging, about how it operated, command and control. It took a party which, in many ways, was slightly chaotic. I mean, Neil Kinnock, if you speak to many people in the Commons, tamed it, which allowed Tony and Gordon to come in after John Smith and kind of build on that. And I think you can't take away from so many of the achievements that the last Labour government made. The problem was they were built on a house of sand. It took the coalition government 5 years to basically undo 13 years of the last Labour governance. And that's because we accepted, and I accept, hindsight is a fantastic thing. Everyone has 20/20 vision with hindsight. But the reality is, if you go back and look at, Gordon Brown's Mansion House speeches, where he's boasting about the fact that we scuppered the European Union's attempt to have a kind of European-wide corporate tax level to stop the race to the bottom, you begin to see how enthralled we were, how much we bought into this kind of Fukuyama end of history idea that, as long as neoliberalism laid, the City of London laid the golden eggs, all we had to do was turn on the taps and redistribute. It's not going to work anymore. It's over. 2008 saw an end to that. And I would argue that actually that those 35, 40 years, if you look objectively at the amount of growth between 79 and 2008, actually overall growth, GDP growth, was greater in the welfare state period, the period of the welfare state. So I actually think, yes, look, Labour won. Labour made a difference to many people's lives in that time, but ultimately it brought in student loans, it brought in PFI, and there's so many things that if you could go back, you want to scream at them, what are you doing? But I also understand, there were certain things that were good, but I think, I got slated 18 months ago when I just become an MP, and I dare to have the temerity to say that Gordon Brown's going to come out and probably criticise Jeremy Corbyn and tell people not to vote for him. And he's going to say that basically Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have any economic credibility. And I said, well, we also have to question, Gordon Brown's economic credibility. And I think he was a fantastic chancellor. If anyone that, in many ways, anyone that who you speak to about Gordon, and he's obviously a very complicated character, but I think what no one will doubt is the fact that his heart, what he wanted to achieve, was in the right place. And I just think it's how he went about it and the means with which he did it. And, New Labour was a product of its time. It was at the height of neoliberalism, and I get that completely. But unfortunately, for much of for some elements of the Labour Party, they were a very conservative party with a small c. With a small c, I'm not calling anyone red Tories, with a small c. And I think people understand that we worked out a really good way of winning elections in the 1990s and noughties. This isn't the 1990s and noughties anymore, and that needs to change. And I think, the lesson I take from that is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also be prepared to be able to criticise what New Labour got wrong and didn't get right, and we'll learn from it.
Two questions before I bring people in. Firstly, you've been talking about an industrial strategy today. Now, the workforce has dramatically changed since Labour was in government, for example, back in 1945. As many people now work in call centres as work down the mines. Retail is one of the biggest employers in the country. And, the service sector, some of these jobs are less back-breaking, less male-dominated than the old industrial jobs. But you don't have communities based around them in the same way. Work is more transient. So in terms of an industrial strategy to rebalance the British economy, what does it look like for you? How is it going to change the nature of work?
I think, first of all, industrial strategy isn't just about the nuts and bolts, the train lines, the power cables, the photovoltaics. It's a massive part of it, the actual hard infrastructure. And the Labour Party is, we are talking about a massive level of reinvestment. And, people say to us, well, how are you going to afford that? Well, it's all out there, the fiscal credibility rule, where we're going to get the money from. And anyone that says you can't do that, you can't. I'll just say, what, if Andrew Neil goes on about that, I just want to say to him, for the last 6 years, you've been telling us what we should be doing, what we can't do, how we should do it, and what you got it wrong yourself. So, you haven't got a leg to stand on. There are a lot of academics and so out there that say we can do it and we will do it. And I think, now is the time where you put your vision into practice and you say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it because it has to be done, because people need it, because the alternative is so terrible. But the other part of industrial strategy is the biggest resource that we have in this country. It's people. Yeah. And that's about education and training. It's about the childcare, universal childcare. It's about the education system we have. And obviously, Jeremy's talked about a national education service, a lifelong education service, which actually means that, throughout your life, we expect the fourth industrial revolution to pick up at a pace of knots in the coming decades. It will mean people's jobs will change quite dramatically throughout the course of their careers. And that means that people are going to need constantly ability to be able to retrain and to re-educate themselves. So I think what we're talking about is how do you take the state and make it flexible and innovative and supportive of people's lives. If they want to go in to work for themselves, they want to be self-employed, we want to extend the social security net to mean that they can be innovative, they can take risk, but also know that there's a safety net there for them. So we actually want to support innovation, support creativity, and be an enabler, rather than picking winners, rather than backing white elephants. So it's about it's about shaping demands, shaping growth in a sustainable way, and in a way that means that you don't leave any of your communities behind. And I think that's the thing now. We've moved on. I think what we understand now is that the solutions of the 20th century are not going to work for the 21st century, and we now need to start basically putting meat on the bone of what socialism in the 21st century looks like, and that's a work in progress.
So finally, before I bring people in, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the polling for Labour, let's just not beat around the bush, is bad, and people got very excited yesterday because the polling improved for Labour substantially, and the Tories went down to a 9-point lead. And the underlying polling is even worse. Leadership, the economy, and so on. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn, Labour under Jeremy Corbyn can win an election? And if that doesn't happen and we lose badly, won't the left just be blamed at a time when right-wing populism is sweeping our country and much of the Western world? And how would we ever get a shot at this again? So are you confident, and how would that happen?
Polls are a tool of the liberal elite, I think. And I think you obsess about them far too much. No, I'm clearly joking. So,
oh, and breathe. And breathe.
Look, we were 17 points behind, 2 weeks when I last looked. So 9 is like kind of, woohoo, it's good. Don't tweet that. It's not great. But I think the thing that we understand, I'm not going to kind of throw out the polls, but the fact that there's been a 9-point swing in the matter of a week or so, or 2 weeks, kind of showed you how volatile things are. And I think people out there are like, what's going on? What's happening? Where's the leadership? Now, do I think Jeremy Corbyn can offer that leadership? Yes, I do. I actually genuinely think he can. And the reason I think that is because I think if there's one thing we've seen that we can be certain about, it's that the pundits and the chatterati, the commentariat, have called it wrong time after time. And I think in this volatile situation, if the Labour Party can get its message, can get its narrative, can do some of the things that we've spoken about tonight, I think it's entirely possible that the Conservative government could implode. They've got as many divisions, if not more, than we have. The whole reason Theresa May is being so cagey about Brexit isn't because she's trying to keep her negotiating hand close to her chest. It's because her own party will tear her apart once they find out what her negotiating position is. That's why she's in that. So they've got their own problems. And I believe in the old adage, it's not often oppositions which win elections, it's governments which lose them. And I think this one is well on course in the way it's acting, the complete chaos and the shambles of Brexit that it's perpetrating. It meant that today I could go out under Jeremy Corbyn and make a genuine pitch to business that Labour is the party of business. Now, I would have been, if I'd come to the PLP and said that, I'd have been laughed out. I would have been laughed out of the PLP. But we can do that, and we did it, and there wasn't a smirk on our faces. We genuinely, because business is absolutely furious with this government. They're absolutely, they are absolutely, apoplectic about what they're doing. So I think things are changing, things are shifting, and I think it's possible that Labour could win an election. I think it would be really difficult. But here's the critical thing. I think for me, and obviously I got in a little bit of trouble for saying this, I think the best chance for Labour to be able to win an election is the issue of Progressive Alliance. Now, a lot of people are saying to me, hold on, Clive, what is it? What have you got about why do you like the Liberal Democrats so much? I don't like the Liberal Democrats so much, but I don't like the Tories. I hate the Tories more. I don't hate the Tories. I dislike the Tories more. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's the same with the Greens. I've got a lot of, Caroline Lucas, the Green Party. Some of their positions I'm not that keen on. Many of them I am. And as I said before, I'd rather be in government with someone like Caroline Lucas than in permanent opposition on the back benches with her next to me and us screaming at each other. So I think this is the issue. Under the first past the post system, we know the Tories are the masters of gaming this system. And it's now incumbent upon the left to be able to game it themselves as well. We've got to vote tomorrow on the boundary changes. You know, they're going to gerrymander the boundaries in this country to make it even more difficult for Labour to win. Scotland is a game changer. I want Scottish Labour to do well whenever the next general election is, but the reality is they've got an uphill struggle, and I don't think they're going to be coming back into the game anytime soon. I'm not talking them down, that's just being pragmatic and realistic about where they are. So that means the SNP are in the room, and we have to think to ourselves, if we can somehow get to a point, and I think it would be difficult for Labour to form a majority, not impossible, but difficult, very difficult for us to form a majority without, you know, substantial results in Scotland helping us turn that around. Then we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we get to a place where we can, in conjunction with the Liberal Democrats, with the Greens, and potentially with the SNP, get into a place where we can kick the Tories out? Now, I do not see the point of fighting constituencies, say, for example, in the southwest of England, where you have around about 30 Tory MPs across the country who won from Liberal Democrats on a ticket of a pro-European, modernist, Cameroonian Conservative Party, where you now have a hardcore, Eurosceptic, Brexit, UKIP-light Tory party in some ways. I think they're extremely vulnerable. They know they're vulnerable. I cannot see the point in Labour standing in those seats where sometimes we almost lost our deposit or came third, and probably in a future election could just pip it for the Conservatives to hold on to that seat. I don't see the point in that, because if we want to kind of drive down the Tory numbers, then I think what we've got to do is start thinking about how the progressive parties of this country, and I know it's sometimes a bit of a stretch to call the Liberal Democrats progressive, but how the central progressive parties of this country can actually form enough of an electoral working pact, if you want to call it, for want of a better word, to be able to keep the Tories out and to form, if necessary, a coalition government, a Labour-led coalition government. We've got to be pragmatic, we've got to be realistic, and if we don't, then I think we're looking potentially at decades of Tory rule. The 21st century will be the century of the Tories. I don't want that. I don't think most of the people in this room should want that either for their future prospects. And I think we now have to start thinking outside of the standard playbook that we've been using for the last 30, 40, 50 years. Move outside of that tribal way of thinking and actually start thinking about how are we going to win and kick the Tories and keep out the authoritarian right in this country. And I think that's what we've got to do next.
Right,